I want to bring this back to a little more specificity because I think in it maybe you can explain a little more the particularities of the Kossuth Museum in the context of Hungary. I think you've spoken very eloquently and urgently about the fact that the current political situation in Hungary is significantly worse than it was even 5 years ago or something like that. But I think your museum has a very particular role in that context, which I think we're fascinated with. And I think I'm not sure how many people in the audience understand that particular context and that particular role. And maybe we are imagining it to be something else than what it is when you actually run it. Because I think, as both a museum that's quote unquote dedicated to a single artist who is undoubtedly one of the premier figures of the Hungarian avant-garde, you're in the position of both kind of representing canonical national culture, but at the same time, you're representing canonical national culture that is positioning itself against the very idea of nationalism as a progressive avant-garde statement. But also within that context, you, at least that's how I read it, there is a misunderstanding of what Kossuth's work stands for. And you've been very good in exploiting this misunderstanding vis-a-vis the political powers that are by focusing on aspects of the work through which you can maybe mobilize critique or you can mobilize resistance. You can mobilize the idea of the progressive in the avant-garde as opposed to the idea of the nationalist in the iconic that the figure is. And maybe you can talk a little bit about that to kind of say how even on a small scale, you know, you're not faced with representing the history of Hungary, but you can, I think, kind of dig deeper into the way in which critique can be constructed.
Uh, well, um, I would like to speak about basic structures and to show that the national context and the national frameworks is not suitable for researching modernism and avant-garde in general. Because modernism is only a tiny part of national culture in Hungary, but its interpretation links into a greater network in the international international history of modernism. And um, I think this wider view of modernism comes into a fundamental conflict with national interpretations. And for me, this is a big question and a big problem. I think paradoxically, the ideas of nation and nationalism are essential to an understanding of modernism. And this paradox demands some examinations. Kossuth Museum is a very small museum. And a part of a larger institution. This is a most important institution of Hungarian literature. This is the Petőfi Literary Museum. And yes, we would like to, it was originally a memorial museum, a memorial to Lajos Kassák, who was the most significant figure of Hungarian avant-garde. And so we would like to show him in a context of international modernism, in the history of international and or historical modernism, but we would like to show also those contemporary artists who links to this idea, the idea of Kashak and historical modernism. So we would like to show this complexity of this question. But I think that this context, it's very important to understand what is nationalism and what is the context of modernity in Central and East European countries.
That's a very interesting question that you open up, and I want to ask that to Doryun as well. Do you think that by even positioning the art that we're collecting, that we're interested in, that we're looking at, that we're framing and phrasing and sort of naming in a certain way, and that way being the context, like we're calling it modern art, we're calling it modernism, we're calling it avant-garde, is through that naming operation, we're already basically removing it from a national context and inscribing it into a sort of broader or shared international context. I mean, Alex, I think that's what you were pointing to at the beginning when you say modernism is the opposite of nationalism. Then you can read it politically, but you can also read it aesthetically. And I think, Edith, you're reading it in both those ways. You're reading it politically and aesthetically by saying, if you talk about nationalism as an artistic category, you might stand in opposition to modernity because in terms of its signifying structures, it produces something else, or it does something else. So you're faced, Doryun, in a way with, if not inventing a national art history, at least inventing a way to document a national art history that is still very much in formation. And how do you deal with the question of modernity or modernism versus other categories of regional or national or local significant, or kind of broader regional significant that might operate in completely different contexts? I mean, you started your presentation by calling it ideological, so that's a big force to reckon with.
Well, I mean, ideologically in the sense that it's very pragmatic, because when you're putting together a collection, often it just comes down to the issue of availabilities, right? And then categorization that are at the first level and at the most basic level before you start thinking a little bit too much about it, because sometimes you can over-theorize and over-conceptualize, and that will just stop you from buying anything. So in a sense, you kind of have to just, right, well, not at MoMA for sure. So I was sort of following Alex's argument, as well as Edith's, of this nationalism as opposite, modernism as opposite of nationalism, and then also the attempt to nationalize modernism as kind of against a certain tyranny, I guess, of internationalism as represented by an institution like MoMA, and perhaps further reinforced by that Universal Declaration that is ironically signed by how many people? 19. And then I don't know if you were intentionally pointing out that they were all Western museum directors, but I mean, that's just, it's quite ironic. But anyway, but I think that's a cheap shot. But yeah, and then if it was motivated by the issue of the repatriation of Elgin marble, I mean, I think that it just seems like the ulterior motive is just so on the surface. But anyway, again, I think that's a cheap shot. But just to try to answer your question, but like trying to answer your question, I mean, I think this is a really complicated question. I mean, it's not that we're putting together the collection, which is still in large part, I mean, we've been doing this only for 2.5 years, and but even after a few more years and maybe even decades, the core will still be where we are located, right? Um, but I guess we sort of kind of take that as a natural condition, and then we are not a national museum of China. There's one in Beijing. It's their job if they want to tell their story. So that's not really our duty, but because we do have this very important collection, where and I often tell people that yes, we are being built in 21st century, so we should come up with a 21st century model for a museum. But if you haven't had proper museums in the 20th century, you should try that first, which is like trying to have a canon the way that MoMA does. And I think there is a great value in trying to tell a national art history in chronological way. I mean, of course, what you have over there is not national, but still, it's ideological in its own way. But the fourth and fifth floors, especially over there. Um, Yeah, that too. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's so nice that it's hanging on the wall here all the time because I have to show it as a slide, to say that we should try to make a diagram like this. Because when you're building a collection, like this kind of goes, I'm all over the place now. But going back to building a collection is a pragmatic issue, but soon comes the necessity of organizing the ideas that are represented by the objects in some ways, and that's really our ultimate responsibility. And obviously there are more ways than one, and nationalist way of doing it is one, but again, we don't really see our project as that way. But having said that, just to give you a sense of how complicated this is, China obviously is a very complicated situation just by its history of disruptions, right? Modernism was there in conversation with France and Japan, especially in the early 20th century, and then the Civil War happens, and then communism comes, and then of course that doesn't mean that modernism is completely over. There is a different kind of modernist aesthetic, or at least modern aesthetic, that comes in the form of socialist realism.
So is the previous history of modernism known, represented, covered by a different museum? Or do you see it the role of M plus to eventually go, back to the beginning of the history to tell the whole sort of? I mean, I love the fact that you're so kind of unreconstructed or embracing an optimist about the need for canonical art history and a sort of chronological telling of that, which I mean, I also like the fact that you're telling it from a perspective of Hong Kong vis-a-vis mainland China, which, I mean, you pointed at that when Uli Sieg was giving his collection to Hong Kong. It was a great, like poking the finger in the eye of mainland China to say that it doesn't go there, because there were certainly enough possible museums in mainland China in terms of infrastructure, maybe not in terms of ideology, but that, I mean, I can't speak to that as an expert, but
Yeah, I mean, I think really it also kind of comes down to that. Again, this is another topic that we can go into, and then it will require a lot of time. But it really became an issue of what museum in all of mainland China can take care of my precious collection, And then he didn't see any possibility there. I mean, I think I'm not misrepresenting him. I think by saying that he'd rather gamble on this museum that's yet to be built, because he really understood that uh, the the attitude, um, and the possibility of professionally, building an institution that was already there with M Plus already a few years ago, was much more secure than the institutions that are already there. I don't think he was already predicting what was going to happen in terms of, the injunction that recently came down from the very political summit of China against, you can make this kind of art but not that kind of art. But still, that is now even more justification of why his choice, or more explanation on why his choice was right. But let me, see now I'm talking about like 12 different things. But just to answer the question of modernism and nationalism again, so I was just saying that China was an extremely complicated situation. Um, and so it is a very unique condition there already. And I was already speaking about how Japan was a very different situation because it westernized or modernized or whatever you call it already starting in the 1870s. Korea is yet another situation, maybe 3 decades later, but its modernity came through colonization. Taiwan is another story. So, like, you're talking about a region that is large, and the countries are adjacent to one another, but they were actually quite separate from one another. I mean, I think this is actually quite different even from all those Eastern European countries, um, that they were on different um, temporalities. They may all have had certain connections to Paris, um, or later to New York, but they were on different clocks until about 1990s. And that's what is going to naturally emerge. And I don't necessarily think of it as nationalist way of doing it. I think it's yet another, if not third way or fourth way of thinking about the many myriad ways of myriad possibilities of relationships between modernism and nationalism. But when we put together this collection, we don't really think in terms of nationalism or constructing a nationalist art history, but it really kind of also comes down to cultural differences, linguistic differences, and the radically different ways that their politics and histories unfolded over the course of 20th century, which certainly affected the development of modernisms in very different ways.
I want to shift the subject a little bit and just pose one more question to Alex, because you began with that on some level. You were sort of pointing out in the statement of the museum treatise, but then also in your reading of the Latin American examples that you brought up, that these fundamental questions of sort of chronology, of belatedness, of epigonality, and so on, are something that we need to reckon with. And I think in many ways these recent attempts of a more global museum are a way of acknowledging that if we continue to talk about it or think about it purely in those terms, in terms of a kind of what I call the tyranny of chronology, we will never be able to kind of exit the Western framework that is ingrained in us. So I wanted to see how, from a scholarly perspective, you reckon with a model that maybe sort of precisely would be willing to suspend the idea that to paint like a fauve in the 1970s means that you're too late. How do you reckon with that? Which is it's a huge problem for us art historians.
Yeah, the number of things there. I take Doryun's point that something shifted in the 1990s, where all the clocks, and that's what we're calling contemporary art, where the clocks somehow, where we're talking about these different clocks of modernity, the multiple modernities, the clocks of multiple modernities, or modernities that are running on different clocks, seem to have come together. And I'll agree with your dates too. And that's why we're even having this discussion about global art. The global is when there's a kind of alignment where you can't really do that anymore. And of course, people do. I mean, look, still people painting lyrical abstract painting out there, right? And there's still people that would say, well, that's just out of date, right? So in other words, it still happens. So I want to check what I'm saying by saying that, that doesn't mean that these claims of out-of-dateness don't exist anymore. But something has come together in the last 25, 30 years that has allowed the possibility for us to think about an interconnected world that's moving roughly on similar clocks. And is this a problematic statement to say? I'm sure that some people would disagree, but generally I think I could try to defend that. So running on in sync, therefore needing to articulate something that is beyond the nation for the way that I'm defining it. I think one of the things that would be helpful as we go into a discussion is if we have an understanding of what is meant by national identity and what is meant by modernism. I mean, nobody, so I took a few notes here. I mean, the discourse of nationalism, the discourse of national identity, this is the belief, if we could agree that the discourse of national identity is the belief that nations and cultures are fundamentally different from peoples of other nations and cultures. Nationalism implies difference of people in other nations. We've seen this. This is a phenomenon since the beginnings of nationalism, which is the 18th century. Those imagined communities of difference, right? Progressively or the opposite. The modernist culture emphasizes that identity can be and has to be. Modernism says I would argue, emphasizes that a must here, that it has to be constructed outside of the boundaries of the model of the nation state. That identity is something that we share. I mean, what's a perfect modernist institution would be the United Nations downstream. Or this building, I suppose. I mean, I don't know. Let's go back to the United Nations. This idea that we can have a world government. That was an interesting idea, and it fell apart. And it's kind of, I mean, look today. I mean, a lot of people have attacked that idea. The reason there are a number of reasons why I brought in this declaration of the importance of the value of museums. But, the first level of reason is that it seemed to kind of begin to answer the question that I was given. The second level is that, look, there's language there that could be useful for us if we're interested. Useful for us in, for those people who are tired of talking about multiple differences, at infinitum, that, what is it, what's the opposite? Like, what is it that does bring us together? What is it that we share? And maybe art can be something that can be used to come up with some propositions about some of the things that we share transnationally. And maybe this language already kind of gives us a foothold, as problematic as it was obviously stated in the first place. On the other hand, it's there, and it can give us, like, okay, well, let's play this out. You've already gone on the record to say this. Well, what about pursuing this idea a bit further and adding our agendas to it? Does that answer your question? What was
I don't know. Well, my question concerned a little bit sort of scholarly terminology or methodology, maybe more specifically speaking, because I think what you positioned in your treatise on the usefulness of the museum or the role of museums is very specifically to kind of establish a museum then maybe as the archetypal or quintessential modernist institution, because if the museum itself is a context through which regional contexts, national contexts, historical contexts, ethnic contexts, spiritual and religious contexts are temporarily suspended or superseded, in precisely that suspension is what, is at core by saying we don't need to give back the Elgin marbles because they now have a new context in which they serve better and broader and more international and better, more people and all that. Then maybe, an understanding of a museum as such already implies an assumed definition of modernity that is maybe in violence to, or at least in tension with, some other possible functions of culture before I call it national or before I call it sort of any other qualifier. That I mean, I don't know. And in a way, you know, the great critics of modernism and modernity have precisely put their finger into that moment. I mean, whenever I'm sort of um, getting too relativist in my own sort of definitions, I reread Hans Edelmeyer's Verlust der Mitte, you know, which is such a wonderful sort of tirade against the history of modernism. And, you know, he locates it precisely with the French Revolution. And ironically, with the museum becoming an architectural form that has its own use, that has its own language, that has its own vocabulary, that has its own um, iconography, if you will, by basically replacing another more comprehensive model of world cohesion, which in his case is Catholic religion. So, you know, if the museum is modernism, and if modernism is anti-national, I would position it's also anti-spiritual or anti-religious, in that it positions a kind of a declared removal from what one might position as sort of traditional or natural, or you know, any of those kind of qualifiers, contexts that are inherent in something. So if you say like, okay, here we have something that can be shared by all and looked at all, I think very useful in that context is the recent reconsideration of the Magicien de la Terre exhibition, which for 20 years was decried as this sort of like, there's somebody who wants to re-spiritualize painting. And somehow in the last 5 years, we've turned a corner and think of it as somehow like the great first global exhibition. So we've become, you know, immune to our own sort of previous critique by kind of, you know, embracing or agreeing that those terminologies are becoming more relative. So yes, I agree with you to a point, because I think there's a foundation of that agreement that in itself already assumes an ideological position of Westernity, maybe.
Well, this isn't. I think I'm responding more to maybe certain points that are brought up by Alex, and I'm sorry if I'm being too reductivist here, but I guess I'm comfortable just saying that yeah, the museum is a Western notion and Western conception, and that's fine. Um, but we're talking about global museum, but somehow kind of turning to this idea of universality somehow seems to reinforce a certain hegemony that has been existing, and so it just seems like it kind of bypasses so many other questions and possibilities of critique of the museum as an institution and how it has developed over the years of colonialism and imperialism, and then somehow in the age of global capital, it's universal. I mean, that just seems a little facile to me. Um, and also the notion of nation, and yes, I think that I agree with the classical notion of what nation is, um, but I guess I don't really have to explain or go deep into how each nation also understands its nationality and its nationalism differently. And maybe I never understood it until I actually moved to the periphery of China to realize that its conception of modern nation is so weird for me that I just cannot understand. And that I'm slowly understanding that, you know, it understands its notion of nation is perhaps not a modernist idea or a modern idea, that it's actually based on, you know, millennia of imperial history that has made a very strange transition to the modern period through a lot of traumas. So when you have that kind of self-understanding of what a nation is, then you know you can't. Then there are going to be some troubles with United Nations, you know, and then any model of global universality that is based on United Nations. I just don't think that's going to work exactly. And just sort of last point, which again, I think we need a lot of time for this, that you know, when you are sitting in a place like MoMA, that question of belatedness or derivation or derivativeness, when you're dealing with any places that are coming later, is such a big problem, and you don't know how to resolve that. And I think, you know, I think you can sort of summarize CMAP's history of the last 5 years as not being able to solve that problem of belatedness, probably. But somehow, at least my experience of moving over there has really kind of changed how you see this belatedness as not a condition that you cannot overcome. It is just a condition, right? But then you can also marry that to a different notion of ownership, a notion that is different from Elgin Marble, question of patrimony and restitution, and is separate from that, right? That these artists who didn't have access to actual Western paintings, um, you know, of the early modernist paintings, they could only see reproductions in stolen books. You know, I think they also have certain ownership to the history that may have already happened in 100 and 150 years ago. So I think when you sort of kind of look at it from, you know, maybe that's where the universality comes in, that, you know, that knowledge and experience is there, and how you absorb it, how you appropriate it, and how you make it into your own, make bad copies, or make something totally unexpected that it becomes own. I think that's sort of the way out of what you are calling the tyranny of chronology. And once you sort of kind of get to that place, then you can also have the confidence of, let's try to make a canon that is different from that chronology over there.
So the way out is what? What's the way out?
The way out is, in a sense, one, accepting. I mean, you have to accept many different things, I guess. Um, that you're not the conditions of your nation state, um, its political history, and its, you know, often screwed up pattern of modernity are just the conditions, you know, and they are not deviations, or they are not perversions of the one right path of modernity. It is what it is. And then, but because of those conditions, that your development is still stunted and belated, but don't think of that condition of belatedness as a handicap, you know? And then, third, then from those acceptances of these conditions, that it's not that, you know, you're always trying to copy or always trying to emulate. You do that, but at the same time, you understand those copying, emulation, derivation in terms of ownership. You know, it's not that like this Western precedents are not ours, but we want to be like that. It's not that, you know. It's more that, okay, well, I mean, that's one of the models that we're going to try, which will always be incomplete, but that process is ours. When they're painting on a tiny canvases in boxes that they have to hide because they could be put in jail.
I want to give Edith the last
Yes,
word
Edith,
before we open it up to the audience.
Um, I try to speak about two different attitudes, and it is not only history and politics, but two different attitude um, and it's very important to understand the differences